London woke beneath a slow, grey drizzle that streaked across glass towers and crowded pavements, the kind of morning that made the city look like it was exhaling sadness. Inside a minimalist apartment on the 12th floor, Ethan Walker sat at his kitchen counter, staring into a mug of untouched coffee. The steam curled upward, then faded, just like the warmth he'd once felt when life still carried a pulse. He had been an architect long enough to know how to design beautiful spaces, but after his breakup with Clara, nothing in his own life felt built to last. The rooms around him looked perfect, clean lines, neutral tones, not a thing out of place. Yet that was the problem, there was no life left in them. When his phone vibrated, the sound echoed like a small explosion. It was a reminder from his assistant about the Boston Design Exhibition, a collaboration between British and American artists and architects. Ethan almost ignored it. Travel had lost its charm. But something deep inside whispered that he needed to go, perhaps not for work, but for something unnamed that was still missing. Across the Atlantic, in a Boston apartment cluttered with canvases and sketchbooks, Lily Carter wiped blue paint from her wrist and sat cross-legged on the floor. Her window overlooked the Charles River, where the morning light scattered like pieces of broken glass across the water. She had always loved that view. It used to make her believe that beauty could exist even in chaos. But lately, her paintings had turned muted, their colors dissolving into pale grays and browns. Grief did that, it drained the world of contrast. 2 years had passed since Daniel, her fiancé, died in a sudden car crash, yet the memory lingered like wet paint that refused to dry. People told her that time would heal, that she would find love again, but Lily hated those clichés. They made her feel like everyone expected her to erase Daniel, as if love were something replaceable. She worked as an art curator for a small gallery downtown, surrounded daily by masterpieces that told stories of passion and loss, but the one story she couldn't rewrite was her own. When night fell in London, Ethan stood at his drafting table, tracing the lines of a new project, a museum inspired by the concept of restored ruins. He liked the idea of rebuilding what had once been broken, even if subconsciously it mirrored his own longing. His friend Mark, a photographer who had watched Ethan's slow descent into numbness, called to check on him. "You can't keep building walls, mate," Mark said over the line. "At some point, you've got to open a door." Ethan laughed quietly, pretending not to understand, but the truth was clear, he'd built emotional architecture stronger than any steel. Later that night, he opened his laptop and scrolled through images of Boston. The city's mix of old brick and modern glass struck something in him, history and renewal existing side by side. He booked the flight before he could talk himself out of it. Meanwhile, Lily spent her evening closing the gallery, her heels echoing softly against the marble floor. She paused before a large abstract piece by a visiting London artist. It was titled, Echoes of Tomorrow. The brushwork was sharp yet fluid, like someone had painted conflict and hope into the same frame. She stared at it for a long moment, unaware that the artist behind the design of the installation's architecture was the very man soon boarding a plane toward her city. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. She smiled faintly, remembering how Daniel used to say rain was the world's way of starting over. "Maybe you're right," she whispered, locking the gallery door behind her. The next morning, Ethan's flight soared above the Atlantic, slicing through clouds lit pink by sunrise. He sat by the window, sketchbook open, but his mind drifted. He wasn't thinking about structures or deadlines, he was wondering when he had last truly felt alive. Every heartbreak leaves an echo, and in the silence of that cabin, he could hear his own. He remembered the argument with Clara, the one that ended everything, and how both of them had mistaken pride for strength. Now, alone 30,000 feet above the ocean, he realized that strength sometimes meant allowing yourself to be seen again. He didn't know that somewhere below those same clouds, a woman named Lily was also fighting to reopen her heart, to remember what color felt like. In Boston, the city was preparing for the International Design Week. Banners fluttered along the harbor, galleries cleaned their glass fronts, and journalists buzzed with excitement. Lily's gallery had been selected to host a special architectural art collaboration, an intersection between form and emotion, between design and feeling. When she received the event roster, she noticed a name that sounded familiar yet distant, Ethan Walker, London, UK. She had no reason to pay attention, dozens of artists were flying in. Still, something about that name lingered, the way certain melodies stay in your head long after you stop listening. 3 days later, when Ethan arrived in Boston, the air smelled of sea salt and maple leaves. the city was brisk but welcoming. He checked into a modest hotel near the harbor, threw his suitcase onto the bed, and took a deep breath. It was strange, he had crossed an ocean, yet the emptiness still followed. That evening, during a private preview at the gallery, he wandered through halls lit by soft amber lights. The artworks around him seemed to pulse with emotion, abstracts bursting with untold stories. Then, from across the room, he noticed her, a woman in a simple navy dress, her hair tied loosely, a hint of paint still on her fingertips. She was adjusting the angle of a spotlight on one of the pieces, unaware that anyone was watching. There was a calm focus in her movements, a quiet strength that felt familiar. Ethan didn't know her name, but something inside him recognized the weight she carried. It wasn't attraction, it was understanding. Lily turned slightly and caught his gaze by accident. For a second, neither of them looked away. It wasn't one of those cinematic, world-stopping moments, it was quieter, like two souls nodding in silent acknowledgement. "You're Ethan Walker, right?" she finally asked, her voice gentle but steady. "I'm Lily. I manage this gallery." Ethan smiled, extending his hand. "So you're the one making my work look better than it is." She laughed, a soft sound, barely audible over the music, but it was the first genuine laugh he'd heard from anyone in weeks. For a brief instant, something shifted inside both of them, a subtle easing of the heaviness they'd been carrying. As the evening went on, they talked, about art, about London, about the stories hidden behind every design. Neither mentioned heartbreak. They didn't need to. Sometimes pain recognizes pain and decides to rest. When the event ended and guests began leaving, Lily walked Ethan to the door. "Welcome to Boston," she said, smiling. "I hope it's kind to you." He nodded, stepping out into the cool night air, unaware that this simple farewell would echo in his mind for days. Behind him, Lily watched through the glass as he disappeared into the streetlights. She didn't understand why, but for the first time in years, she wanted tomorrow to come faster. That night, as Ethan lay in his hotel room, he replayed their conversation, her voice lingering like a soft aftertaste of something he hadn't known he missed. On the other side of the city, Lily sat by her window, gazing at the river that shimmered under the moon. Somewhere, deep down, she felt a pulse returning, quiet, tentative, alive. Two broken hearts had met without knowing they were meant to help each other heal. The distance between them had begun to shrink, not measured in miles, but in understanding. Boston wore the color of autumn, amber trees lining the sidewalks, crisp air brushing across the Charles River, and cafes spilling soft jazz through their open doors. For most, it was just another season, but for Ethan Walker, the city had begun to hum with a quiet familiarity, as though it was slowly learning his rhythm. Since the exhibition night, he had found himself returning to the gallery almost every afternoon under the pretense of finalizing installation details. The truth, though, was simpler and far less professional. Lily Carter had become the most unexpected part of his day. She greeted him with the same polite smile each time, offering him coffee she brewed too strong and opinions she delivered too honestly. There was no flirtation, no rush, no stage charm, just a comfort that felt like an old song rediscovered. Yet beneath that calm was an unspoken awareness, something neither dared to acknowledge out loud. Ethan had always believed that the most beautiful designs were born from balance, light against shadow, symmetry against chaos, and Lily, in her quiet resilience, seemed to embody that perfectly. She was all gentle contradictions, confident yet uncertain, strong yet scarred, composed yet quietly breaking in places he couldn't see. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled faintly in the distance, he found her sitting on the gallery floor surrounded by art catalogs. "You look like you're planning world domination," he teased, leaning against the wall. Lily laughed softly without looking up. "Just trying to decide which artists to feature next month. You'd think choosing beauty would be easy." He stepped closer, crouched beside her, and said, "Sometimes beauty isn't about perfection. It's about honesty." When she finally met his eyes, something wordless passed between them, a pulse of recognition that neither could dismiss. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the first time in years that both felt something move inside the hollow space where pain had lived too long. Over the next few weeks, their lives began to intersect beyond the walls of the gallery. There were coffee runs that stretched into long conversations about books, architecture, and the strange ways people heal. There were late-night text exchanges, small things like, "Did you see the sunset tonight?" or, "I can't stop thinking about that mural near the park." Each message carried warmth, a thread slowly stitching two separate lives into one pattern. For Ethan, the city no longer felt foreign. He began sketching at a cafe near the harbor, the same cafe Lily visited on her way to work. Sometimes they met there by accident, sometimes by design. The world around them carried on, cars honking, strangers rushing, but inside those small, shared moments, time seemed to soften. One evening, after the gallery closed, Lily invited Ethan to see her private art studio, a small loft filled with unfinished canvases and the smell of turpentine. "It's not much," she said, embarrassed by the chaos. But Ethan was mesmerized. "It's real," he replied. "I like real." He walked slowly, tracing his fingers along the edges of a half-painted canvas. "You paint like you're trying to tell the truth," he said. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "I guess I am. I just haven't figured out what the truth is yet." Outside, the rain fell harder, tapping the windows in soft rhythm. Ethan turned to her and said quietly, "Maybe the truth isn't something you find. Maybe it's something you let happen." For a long moment, they stood there, the air thick with unspoken emotion, the kind that makes silence louder than words. Lily looked at him, unsure if she was ready to let anyone that close again. Ethan wanted to step forward but didn't. He respected her distance, maybe because he understood it too well. Days turned into weeks, and Boston's cold deepened. The gallery's exhibit ended, and Ethan's project entered its final phase. Soon he'd have to return to London. The thought pressed against him like a storm cloud he couldn't ignore. He didn't want to imagine the city without Lily's presence, her laugh that always began softly and ended brighter, her quiet resilience, her way of making every conversation feel significant. Yet he also knew better than to rush something fragile. Love built too quickly could collapse under its own weight. One night, they found themselves walking along the harbor, their breath visible in the frosty air. "You'll be leaving soon," Lily said, her tone casual but her eyes betraying the ache beneath. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah. Maybe for a while." She looked away. "You'll forget this place. People always do." He stopped walking. "I don't think I could," he said quietly. "Some places, some people, stay with you." That night, neither of them slept. Ethan sat by the hotel window, sketching without purpose, his pencil tracing curves that somehow began to resemble her profile, the slope of her neck, the fall of her hair, the small tilt of her smile. In her apartment, Lily scrolled through photos on her phone, the gallery opening, the coffee shop, the mural they both liked, every image echoing a memory she hadn't meant to create. She told herself it was nothing serious, that people come and go, that connections like this never last. But even as she whispered those lies to herself, her heart disagreed. The next morning, Boston greeted them with a soft snowfall, the first of the season. The city glittered under white silence, and something about it made everything feel suspended in time. Ethan texted her, "Meet me at the Harbor Cafe. One last coffee before I go." She hesitated before typing back, "I'll be there." When she arrived, he was already waiting, hands wrapped around a steaming mug, eyes reflecting both anticipation and regret. They talked about simple things, the exhibition's success, travel plans, London's weather, all while avoiding the one thing that mattered. Finally, Lily broke the silence. "I'm glad you came here," she said softly. "You reminded me that I could still feel something." Ethan's throat tightened. "You reminded me that I could still believe in something," he replied. Their eyes met, and the cafe noise faded, replaced by the quiet hum of everything unsaid. When it was time to leave, Ethan stood and smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Take care of yourself, Lily." She forced a smile back. "You too, Ethan." He reached for his coat, hesitated, then leaned forward, not to kiss her, but to whisper, "Some distances aren't meant to be permanent." And then he walked out into the falling snow, disappearing into the blur of white. Lily stayed seated for a long time, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, her heart echoing with the sound of his footsteps fading away. Outside, as Ethan climbed into the taxi to the airport, he glanced back once, half expecting to see her standing there. But she wasn't. Still, he felt her presence, like a heartbeat beneath the city's cold pulse. He opened his sketchbook one last time before takeoff and drew the harbor, two figures standing apart under the snow. He titled it simply, When Worlds Collide. And though they both returned to their separate lives, one in London, one in Boston, something irreversible had already begun. Two lives once broken had touched, leaving behind fingerprints neither could erase. Fate, patient and deliberate, wasn't finished with them yet. London welcomed Ethan home with its usual chill, a grey sky stretched across the horizon like a curtain that refused to open. He stepped into his apartment and felt that familiar echo, the one that always greeted him before he even turned the lights on. It wasn't loneliness exactly, it was the silence that lives where laughter used to be. The flight from Boston had been quiet, but his thoughts weren't. They were filled with the soft cadence of Lily's voice, the glimmer in her eyes when she spoke about art, the way she smiled as if every moment was a delicate secret she hadn't decided whether to share. He unpacked his suitcase mechanically, but when he found the brochure from the Boston Gallery tucked between his shirts, he stopped. It had her handwriting on the corner, just a note that said, "For the next time you visit." It wasn't much, but in that moment, it felt like an anchor. Across the Atlantic, Boston's winter deepened, and Lily tried to convince herself that nothing had changed. Her days returned to routine: open the gallery, arrange new exhibits, smile for visitors, close up, and paint in silence. But she could no longer ignore the hollow pause between those hours, the way her mind would drift toward thoughts of Ethan, wondering if he was sketching something new, wondering if he'd already forgotten the sound of her laughter. It wasn't love yet, not something she could name or admit, but it was something, and it scared her. She had spent so long learning how to live with loss that she didn't know how to live with possibility. It started with a message, simple, unplanned, sent late one London night when Ethan couldn't sleep. "I saw a painting today that reminded me of you. Colors trying to escape from the dark." Lily read it the next morning, her heart thudding faster than it should. She replied, "That's how most of my days feel lately. The colors still trying." And just like that, the distance began to shrink. The messages became a rhythm, a heartbeat. Across time zones, photos of morning coffee cups, little snippets of art, fragments of thoughts they didn't share with anyone else. When Ethan stayed late at his firm, designing a new project called Open Sky, she'd be the one to tell him to take a break. When Lily struggled to finish a painting, he'd send her sketches of how he imagined her art would live in a space he'd design one day. They weren't just talking, they were slowly rebuilding the parts of themselves they thought were gone. One evening, Ethan called her while walking through the streets of London. The city lights reflected on wet pavement, cars passing like streaks of memory. "You sound different," Lily said through the speaker, her voice warm, faintly teasing. "Different how?" he asked. "Lighter," she replied. "Like someone who's remembering how to breathe." He smiled, glancing at the Thames glimmering under the bridge. "Maybe I just found someone worth breathing with," he said softly. There was silence after that, not awkward, just full. Lily didn't know what to say. For years, she had lived in grayscale, now someone was painting her world again, one word at a time. Months passed. Seasons turned. Ethan's project in London gained recognition, an architectural concept built around emotional healing spaces, inspired by the idea of light returning through broken walls. In interviews, he spoke about the art of rebuilding after loss, though he never mentioned Lily by name. Meanwhile, in Boston, Lily's newest collection, titled The Distance Between Us, became her gallery centerpiece. Each painting was filled with fragments of color struggling to find balance, every stroke echoing the conversations they'd shared across oceans. But with every growing connection came the ache of reality. The calls grew longer, but the silence afterward grew heavier. Both knew that something so fragile couldn't live forever in digital form. "You should come back," Lily said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "Boston misses your sarcasm." Ethan laughed softly. "And you?" he asked. There was a pause, then she said, "Maybe." The line fell silent for a moment, both hearts racing in sync though separated by time zones and fears. Weeks later, an email arrived in Lily's inbox, a ticket confirmation. Ethan was coming to Boston for a design lecture. She stared at the screen, her breath caught between excitement and disbelief. For days she replayed what she'd say when she saw him again. Maybe nothing at all. Maybe everything. When he arrived, Boston was in full bloom, cherry blossoms lining the parkways, sunlight dripping through branches. Lily waited outside the gallery, hands trembling. When he appeared, walking toward her with that quiet confidence and shy smile, something inside her cracked open. "You're really here," she said, almost laughing. "You doubted me," he replied. "Always," she teased. And then, as if no time had passed, they fell into step beside each other, talking about everything and nothing, about London's chaos and Boston's peace, about how life somehow felt more real when shared. That evening, they visited the harbor again, the same place where snow had once fallen between them. Now, the air was warm, and the city shimmered in gold. Ethan turned to her and said, "You know, I designed something recently that reminded me of you." "Oh really?" she said, pretending not to blush. "What's that?" He smiled. "A home that feels like light never has to ask for permission." She looked at him, confused but moved. "That's beautiful." He shrugged lightly. "So are you." The words hung there, fragile but true. Neither tried to fill the silence that followed. Some truths don't need explaining. As night descended, they sat by the water, watching reflections ripple across the surface. Lily finally spoke. "I used to think love meant never losing someone. But maybe it's just finding someone who helps you live again." Ethan looked at her for a long time, the city. Lights mirrored in his eyes. "Maybe that's what we've been doing," he said. "Learning to live again." When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. The warmth between their palms was quiet but steady, not fireworks, not grand gestures, just the calm recognition of two hearts that had finally found room to breathe. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring or if distance would return to steal this away again, but for that moment, under the Boston skyline, they didn't care. The next day, Ethan's lecture was a success. He spoke about emotional architecture, how spaces carry memory, how walls remember laughter, how design can reflect healing. As he spoke, he caught Lily's gaze in the audience, and everything he said became less about buildings and more about her. Afterward, when they met backstage, she smiled proudly. "You spoke like someone who believes in love again." Ethan grinned. "Maybe I finally do." That night, back in her studio, Lily began painting again, bright, fearless strokes of color that bled into one another like sunrise breaking through the clouds. And across the room, Ethan watched her, realizing that the spaces we fill in life aren't always made of walls or art, sometimes they're the spaces between two people learning how to be whole again. Outside, the city lights flickered softly, and the river carried their reflection like a promise. For once, neither of them felt the need to look away. Because for the first time since their worlds collided, the spaces between them were no longer empty. They were alive. The days after Ethan's lecture felt golden, like the city itself had turned softer just for them. Boston glowed under a tender sun, and for once, life seemed almost simple. Ethan and Lily moved through the days with an easy rhythm, breakfasts at the cafe near the harbor, lazy walks through the art district, quiet evenings spent in her studio where silence didn't feel like emptiness anymore but peace. The gallery had never been so alive, her newest pieces shimmered with hope, vibrant and fearless. Ethan helped her hang them, adjusting each frame with the kind of care reserved for something sacred. There was laughter, light teasing, small touches that said more than words ever could. But beneath that fragile beauty lingered a shadow neither of them wanted to name, the past, patient and waiting, like a storm hovering just beyond the horizon. It came one morning as Ethan sat at the cafe, waiting for Lily, sketchbook open, coffee untouched. A voice behind him said his name, soft, familiar, almost haunting. He turned, and there she was, Clara, the woman he had once loved, the one who had broken him so completely he didn't believe in beginnings anymore. She smiled hesitantly, her eyes carrying the apology she had never given. "Ethan," she said quietly, "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." He froze for a moment, his heart stumbling over the sudden weight of memory. "Neither did I," he replied, his tone polite, cautious. She explained that she was in Boston for a project, an interior design collaboration connected to the same exhibition network that had brought him there months ago. The world, it seemed, had a cruel sense of timing. "You look good," she said softly. "Better than before." He gave a small smile. "Maybe I finally started breathing again." And though he meant it, he couldn't ignore the flicker of confusion rising inside him. When Lily arrived minutes later, she saw them through the cafe window, Ethan leaning across the table, Clara laughing quietly, his expression unreadable. For a second, she hesitated at the door, her pulse tightening. She wasn't jealous, at least, that's what she told herself. She knew nothing about the woman sitting with him, but something in Ethan's eyes told her this wasn't just a stranger. When she finally stepped inside, Ethan stood quickly, guilt flashing across his face. "Lily, this is Clara," he said. "An old friend." Clara extended her hand, polite, composed. "Nice to meet you. I've heard your gallery is incredible." Lily smiled faintly, shaking her hand, masking the unease curling inside her. "Thanks," she said, voice steady. "We try our best." The conversation that followed was short, but the silence afterward lasted much longer. Later that night, in Lily's studio, the distance between them was almost visible. Ethan sat by the window, staring at the city lights, while Lily cleaned her brushes in silence. "You don't have to explain," she said finally, her tone calm but clipped. "I get it. Everyone has a past." He turned toward her, frustration mingling with regret. "It's not what you think. She just showed up, out of nowhere." Lily nodded without looking up. "Of course. And you had coffee. That's fine." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying what she was trying to hide. Ethan stood, stepping closer. "Lily, look at me. Whatever that was, it's over. It ended years ago." She looked up then, eyes shimmering with a sadness he hadn't seen before. "Does it ever really end, though? Because when I saw you with her, I didn't see someone who'd moved on. I saw someone who still remembers how it felt." Her words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. That night, after he left, Lily painted until dawn, angry, chaotic strokes of red and black swallowing her canvas. It was as if every fear she'd buried rose to the surface, the fear of losing someone again, the fear of being not enough, the fear that healing was just an illusion. She told herself she was being unreasonable, but reason never wins against the heart. Across the city, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat by his hotel window, staring at the skyline, replaying every moment. Clara had stirred something he thought was long gone, not love, but guilt. Guilt for how he had ended things, guilt for how broken he'd been, guilt for daring to feel whole again with someone new. He picked up his phone more than once to call Lily, but every time, he stopped. What would he say? That his past had walked back into his life and reminded him just how fragile he still was. Days passed. Their messages grew shorter. Their laughter turned hesitant. Even when they met, there was a carefulness between them, as though one wrong word might make everything collapse. The distance they had once conquered began to return, not measured in miles this time, but in silence. Lily buried herself in work, curating a new exhibit titled, Unfinished Things. The irony wasn't lost on her. Ethan, meanwhile, considered flying back to London early. Maybe it's for the best, he told himself, though he didn't believe it. One evening, Clara appeared again, this time at the gallery. Lily saw her before Ethan did. "You came to see him, didn't you?" Lily asked, her voice calm but heavy. Clara sighed. "I just wanted closure. We never had that." Lily crossed her arms. "Some doors stay closed for a reason." Before Clara could answer, Ethan entered. The look on his face, surprise mixed with exhaustion, said everything. "Clara, what are you doing here?" he asked. She smiled sadly. "Saying goodbye, properly this time." Then she looked at Lily. "You're lucky, you know. He doesn't let people in easily." And with that, she turned and left, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The silence that followed was unbearable. Ethan turned to Lily, searching her face for something. Understanding, forgiveness, anything. "She's gone," he said quietly. "For good." Lily didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice trembled. "Maybe. But what she reminded me is that love isn't about who stays the longest. It's about who stays real when things get hard." Her words sank deep, lingering between them like smoke. Ethan stepped closer. "Then let me be real now," he whispered. "I don't want to lose you, Lily. I've spent too many years living inside walls. You're the first person who ever made me want to step outside them again." Her eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head slightly. And I don't want to be another wall you hide behind. She turned away, unable to hold his gaze. Maybe we both need space. To remember who we were before we found each other. Ethan's voice broke. And what if I don't want to remember that, man? She smiled sadly. Then you'll have to learn who you are without me first. When he left, the door closing behind him sounded final. Lily sank to the floor, tears falling freely for the first time in years, not for Daniel, not for the past, but for a future she'd almost believed in. Across the city, Ethan packed his things, his flight to London booked for the next morning. As the plane took off, he looked down at Boston disappearing beneath the clouds, his heart heavier than it had been in a long time. Back in her studio, Lily stood before a blank canvas, brush in hand, unable to move. The city outside buzzed with life, but inside, she felt only silence, the heavy kind that comes after love has been spoken but not answered. Both of them wondered, in their separate corners of the world, if healing always comes with heartbreak, if love was just another name for learning how to lose gently. But fate, as always, was not done with them yet. Sometimes distance is not an ending, but a pause before something true begins again. And for a moment, it felt like she was right there beside him, her hand brushing his. The ache in his chest was unbearable. When he got home that night, he opened his sketchbook and began to draw, not people, not cities, but her. The way her eyes caught the light, the curve of her smile, the way her hair framed her face when she painted. Hours passed unnoticed. When he finally looked up, his apartment floor was covered in sketches of Lily. He realized then that distance hadn't erased her, it had only made her more vivid. Meanwhile, in Boston, Lily was at her gallery late one night, preparing for the opening of her New York show. As she adjusted the final piece, she froze. It was the portrait Ethan had drawn of her on that quiet Sunday morning months ago, charcoal lines capturing her with terrifying accuracy. She had forgotten she'd left it in storage. Now, staring at it again, she felt her heart twist. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a memory, a promise, a piece of her that still belonged to him. She tried to put it away, but her hands wouldn't move. Instead, she sat on the floor, holding the frame, tears falling silently as the city hummed outside. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to say it out loud, "I miss you." 2 days later, Ethan received an email invitation to the New York exhibition, Lily's name in bold across the header. His pulse quickened. He hadn't planned to go. He had a full schedule, meetings lined up, deadlines to meet. But something inside him, call it instinct, call it love, refused to stay quiet. That night, he booked a flight. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't even tell himself what he was hoping for. When Lily arrived in New York, she was nervous. It wasn't her first major show, but it felt different. This one carried pieces of her she hadn't meant to reveal, paintings born out of loss and longing. The gallery buzzed with people and chatter, champagne glasses clinking, the low hum of admiration filling the space. She smiled, thanked guests, accepted praise. But her eyes kept drifting toward the door, searching for something, or someone, she couldn't admit she wanted to see. And then, just before closing, she saw him. Ethan stood near the entrance, rain still glistening on his coat, looking both nervous and alive in a way that made her heart stop. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to slow around them, the voices fading, the lights dimming, as if the universe had paused just to give them this moment. When he finally stepped forward, she felt her throat tighten. "You came," she whispered, barely audible. He nodded, his voice rough. "I had to. I've been walking in circles without you." For a long time, they just looked at each other, no explanations, no apologies. Just two people standing in the wreckage of what they almost lost. Ethan's eyes wandered over her work, stopping at a painting of two figures standing apart beneath a storm. "That one," he said softly, "it feels like us." Lily smiled faintly. "It is. I painted it the night you left." He took a breath, then said, "Lily, I made a mistake leaving like that. I thought space would make things clearer, but all it did was show me how much I need you. You said love is about who stays real when things get hard. So here I am, real, scared, but here." She stepped closer, tears welling. "And what if I'm still scared too?" He reached out, gently touching her hand. "Then we'll be scared together." The air between them shifted, warm, electric, alive. For the first time in months, she let herself breathe again. The storm she'd been carrying inside her finally began to break, not with thunder, but with relief. Guests accepted praise. But her eyes kept drifting toward the door, searching for something or someone she couldn't admit she wanted to see. And then, just before closing, she saw him. Ethan stood near the entrance, rain still glistening on his coat, looking both nervous and alive in a way that made her heart stop. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to slow around them, the voices fading, the lights dimming, as if the universe had paused just to give them this moment. When he finally stepped forward, she felt her throat tighten. "You came," she whispered, barely audible. He nodded, his voice rough. "I had to. I've been walking in circles without you." For a long time, they just looked at each other, no explanations, no apologies. Just two people standing in the wreckage of what they almost lost. Ethan's eyes wandered over her work, stopping at a painting of two figures standing apart beneath a storm. "That one," he said softly, "it feels like us." Lily smiled faintly. "It is. I painted it the night you left." He took a breath, then said, "Lily, I made a mistake leaving like that. I thought space would make things clearer, but all it did was show me how much I need you. You said love is about who stays real when things get hard. So here I am, real, scared, but here." She stepped closer, tears welling. "And what if I'm still scared too?" He reached out, gently touching her hand. "Then we'll be scared together." The air between them shifted, warm, electric, alive. For the first time in months, she let herself breathe again. The storm she'd been carrying inside her finally began to break, not with thunder, but with relief. Later that night, after the exhibition ended and the lights dimmed, they walked through the quiet streets of New York. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement glistening. Ethan took her hand, and she didn't pull away. They didn't need to talk about the past anymore. What mattered was the feeling, the quiet understanding that sometimes love isn't about fixing what's broken but choosing to build again, even after the storm. As they stood at the corner where the city lights met the sky, Lily whispered, "I was afraid finding you would mean losing myself again." Ethan smiled softly. "Maybe finding each other is how we both find ourselves." For the first time in a long time, they both believed it. The night carried on around them, soft, infinite, full of promise. And though they didn't know what the future would bring, one thing was certain: love, when it's real, always finds its way back home. The morning light of New York spilled softly through the hotel window, casting golden streaks across the sheets where Ethan and Lily sat, quiet but not uncomfortable. The storm had passed, both outside and within them. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace, fragile, tender, but real. Lily sipped her coffee, wrapped in a blanket, watching Ethan sketch absent-mindedly on a napkin. He wasn't drawing anything specific, just lines and curves that seemed to drift like his thoughts. "You still draw when you think too much," she said with a smile. He looked up, the corners of his mouth lifting. "And you still notice everything." They laughed, not the nervous kind that fills silence, but the kind that feels like coming home. That morning turned into a day of rediscovery. They wandered through Central Park, sharing stories they hadn't dared to tell before. Lily spoke about the fear that had followed her since Daniel's death, how she'd blamed herself for too long, how she'd been terrified of being seen, really seen, again. Ethan listened quietly, his gaze soft but steady. When she finished, he took her hand and said, "Love doesn't erase what we've lost, Lily. It helps us carry it without falling apart." Those words stayed with her, echoing through every step they took. And for the first time, she realized healing wasn't forgetting, it was learning to breathe in the same space as your pain and still choose to open your heart. That evening, they found themselves at the harbor, where the city lights rippled across the water like constellations on the sea. It reminded them both of Boston, of where it had all begun. "It feels like forever ago," Lily whispered. Ethan smiled faintly. "It feels like yesterday." They stood there in silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. For Ethan, this wasn't just about finding love again, it was about forgiving himself, for the years he'd spent hiding, for the chances he didn't take. For Lily, it was about forgiving himself, for the years he'd spent hiding, for the chances he didn't take. For Lily, it was about trusting again, trusting that love could exist without breaking her. The air around them was calm, the world holding its breath as if it too was waiting for something. Do you think, Lily asked softly, that love ever really starts over? Or does it just continue in another form? Ethan thought for a moment, his eyes fixed on the water. I think when we find the right person, it doesn't start or end. It just becomes. He turned to her then, his voice steady but full of emotion. Lily, I didn't know what I was looking for when I came to Boston. I thought I was rebuilding a career, maybe finding a version of myself I'd lost. But it was you. It was always you. Tears filled her eyes, not of sadness but of release, the kind that comes when the heart finally understands what it's been holding onto all along. And I, she said, voice trembling, spent so long painting what I'd lost, trying to bring it back to life. But when you walked into that gallery, everything changed. You didn't replace what was gone, Ethan. You reminded me I still had more to live for. He stepped closer, their foreheads touching, their breaths mingling. When I found you, he whispered, I found the part of me I thought was gone forever. They kissed then, not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet truth. It wasn't the beginning of a fairy tale, nor the ending of one. It was something better, real, imperfect, and beautifully human. Months passed. Their lives intertwined naturally, not rushed but deliberate, like two rivers that had always been meant to meet. Lily moved some of her work to a new studio in London, where Ethan continued to teach and paint. They learned how to balance independence with togetherness, laughter with silence, passion with peace. There were arguments, of course, over late nights, missed dinners, messy paint spills, but they no longer feared them. They'd learned that love wasn't the absence of conflict, but the decision to stay through it. On a quiet Sunday morning, one much like the first time they'd met, Ethan found Lily sitting by the window, her sketchbook open. She was drawing something small, simple, two intertwined hands beneath a soft skyline. What's that? He asked, leaning over her shoulder. She smiled. It's us. Not the grand version, just us. The ordinary, everyday kind of love. He kissed her temple. That's my favorite kind. Years later, that same sketch would hang in their home, framed above the fireplace, surrounded by laughter, shared memories, and the comforting chaos of a life they built together. They never needed to say forever out loud, because they lived it in every ordinary moment, in morning coffee, in quiet walks, in the space between heartbeats. And if someone asked them how it all began, Ethan would smile and say, in a gallery filled with broken pieces. And Lily would add softly, but what we found was something whole. Because in the end, when I found you wasn't just their story, it was a reminder that love doesn't rescue you. It finds you where you are, helps you heal, and stays to see who you become after the storm.